Hello, everyone, and welcome to Code Conversations. I'm Matthew Sheahan, the current president of Code. And before we begin, Code acknowledges that our association spans land across Turtle Island, which is the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples. We honor them as the original storytellers and stewards of this land. May we never forget their legacies, and may we learn well the lessons their descendants have to teach us about living on and with the earth. We will practice the sign of respect, acknowledge the rich history of these lands and Indigenous nations, honor the truth of the past, and uphold our original treaty, the Two-Row Wampum, to peacefully care for the land and each other through our drama and dance teaching practices. And I right now am coming at you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Wendat Huron peoples. And as an organization, it was really important for Code to have not only a land acknowledgement, but a call to action to get us thinking about ways in which, through our drama and dance teaching practices, we could try to provoke conversation to hopefully enact some kind of change down this journey of reconciliation, which is kind of the point of this conversation today. So before I introduce why we're having this conversation, I'm just going to go around the Zoom room here and have everyone introduce themselves. So first, we'll start with Arwyn Carpenter.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm Arwyn Carpenter. I'm here in Toronto under Treaty 13, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, and I'm a queer and trans dancer, choreographer, writer, and educator. Based mainly here in Toronto, but I also spend a lot of time in Prince Edward County, where I love to connect with the water. The water for me, it's really healing and important. And when I'm in the city, I miss it a lot. Even though we have access to the lake here, but I don't.
You don't want to go. So you don't want to go swimming in the lake that often. Right there's sometimes.
Yeah. So pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Moving on from Arwyn to Troy, Maracle.
Bueno, Geraldo. Sego, suego. Costa Cerro Guerrero, Young Guts. Gandege, Niguagano. Ganyonge Haga. Good evening, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm bringing you welcome from my territory of Gandege, also known as Tyndonega, Mohawk Territory, which is on the north shore of Lake Ontario, north of Prince Edward County. And I brought greetings to you in my language, which is Ganyongeha, or the Mohawk language, and welcomed you to this territory. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's been a few minutes that I've known this handsome fella here with the mustache who's rocking Movember. So I'm looking forward to this. So yeah, I won't tease you too much.
Well, you can tease all you want. I look at my own face and I'm kind of disgusted by it. As I said before we started recording, there's only so many people that can hold that mustache really well on their face, and I'm not one of them. So this conversation came about, this proposal that I had an idea for this conversation came about after the roundtable discussion Arwyn and I led at the recent Code conference in Hamilton. And there were a lot of really good questions raised in that roundtable, and a really good long discussion, over 90 minutes. However, when you leave there's always so many more questions. I believe, like, out of all the questions were actually posed by people on their little index cards, we maybe actually got to 4 of them out of dozens of questions. So we're gonna today just deal with 6 of those questions from a drama, dance, and Indigenous perspective. And so you'll be hearing a lot of different perspectives on a variety of different questions. So we're going to dive right into question number 1. So the first question was, how do we, through a settler colonial lens, navigate our own guilt or shame when teaching Indigenous content? It's a good question. They're all anonymous questions, so I didn't have anyone like write their names on it or anything. So who would like to deal with that question first?
I'll jump in, and okay. I think first and foremost, I have to put this out there that even though I'm coming at this from a Mohawk perspective, it's only a Mohawk perspective, and it's my perspective as an Indigenous person who's been raised in my community. But I sometimes have a hard time speaking on behalf of an entire group of people. I don't sometimes, I do have a hard time with
it. And I mean, like, you are an Indigenous person with a perspective in this conversation.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And this is one of those questions, believe it or not, is not that uncommon. We often hear this in our positions. So I never shared, but I'm the Indigenous education lead for the Hastings and Prince Edward School Board. So I work with a lot of teachers and administrators and students to, navigate some of these pieces, as we might say. But this one's a hard one. If I'm coming at it from an Indigenous standpoint, I'll be a little bit cold here and say it's actually not our role to help you guys navigate that guilt and shame. But as I shared earlier with a colleague, I said, but it's not about shame. When we're talking about our truths and our experiences, we're not doing it to shame people. We're not doing it to make people feel guilty. We're just trying to bring light to the darkness that has happened in this country. We're trying to bring that truth so that we can move forward in a good way. As Matt, you referenced the Gaswenta, the two-row wampum. The original tenets of that agreement was that our people would live side by side, and we would collaborate, we would work beside each other, but we would never interfere in each other's business as far as our laws, our governance, all of those pieces. But we would live beside each other in peace, friendship, and respect. And I think, that's really what it's about, bringing the truth forward so that we can get back to those original principles of living beside each other with peace, friendship, and respect. So I often will say, if reconciliation is to happen, we have to have those things first. But please don't ask Indigenous people to solve the issues. It's like asking African Americans to fix the issue around slavery. You would never do that, right? So anyway, that's just
For sure.
That's just where I'm coming from on this. I don't know where Matt, you and Arwyn sit on it, but what are your thoughts? I am
What are
curious
the-
to hear that.
I'm curious to hear Arwyn's thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Well, this question, how do we navigate our own guilt or shame when teaching Indigenous content? I think something that's important to ask even prior to that question is, why are we teaching this content? And to have a solid answer for that. Many teachers feel like this is, just sort of an additional curriculum, responsibility, and they haven't investigated for themselves what it means to them. And so before we can get to the guilt or shame, we got to get to the why of our desire to teach this. For me, my personal journey, I was frantic about climate collapse and what we as our capitalist culture is doing to our planet. And when I began to study Indigenous worldview and Indigenous approaches to reciprocity and understanding how to live in a good way, to me, that seemed like the only way forward. Like the only way we're going to survive and maintain life on this planet is if we can begin to understand, to move away from capitalism and to begin to respect these ideas. So yeah, reconciliation, my core belief is that the Indigenous worldview is of utmost importance for learning anything, right? And to come at it for kind of through that perspective. So definitely guilt and shame come up. And I carry it in my body as a white settler, but I teach dance. So sometimes you can move through the guilt. You can release some of those heavy emotions through movement, and also through very deliberate, explicit anti-racism work. So you gotta be doing the work, which for me means educating my students, but also my fellow teachers, talking about it with my neighbors, bringing it up as frequently as possible, so that it's not just, ticking the box on the curriculum. It's really about changing people's view. Yeah, that's what I would say. How about you, Matt?
100%. Yeah, I would argue actually that sometimes people need to think about why they feel guilt or shame. Because I mean, there's a difference between being uncomfortable and discomforted by what we're learning, which we should. I mean, if we're bringing in some content in some way, I think for me, when we think about guilt or shame, it's like first, I mean, there's different. It echoes and mirrors that discomfort a lot. But I mean, like if we're doing the work, it should, and in my opinion, it should be more about like, are we not doing the work? Are we shying away from it because of the discomfort? That would, in my opinion, you're guilty of if you're doing that. And I think that that's something that everyone needs to get over. I agree with Arwyn. Actually, I was just looking at something for another presentation I'm doing later on that was talking about like the Indigenous framework, Indigenous pedagogy. And I've always argued that drama and dance really, especially through the creative process and the holistic nature of drama and dance, have tenets of they share things in common with that framework, and that we need to dig into that. It's an approach, not just about the material that you're covering. And so I mean, like the approach itself is super important. And so when talking about guilt or shame, I think you need to an individual needs to face it within themselves, like, why do you feel guilty? I had guilt not about what I was teaching and not about history necessarily, but about my own viewpoints before I started learning certain things and unlearning my own biases that I had deeply ingrained myself. But I mean, doing the work though was how I was able to work through that guilt or shame. That was mine. It was mine because it was my own views that I held that I didn't even realize I held at times. And I think if the further we get into the work itself and bringing in an appreciative way, not an appropriative way, in our drama and dance classrooms, we build that capacity in ourselves, and we build that capacity in our students to let go of that and to be creative with it and to try to really have those difficult discussions. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, I really think you hit on something there with the unlearning part, right? But at the same time, Matt, I have shared with other educators, don't feel guilty about not knowing something, because unless you've been taught, how are you supposed to have known, right? But if after you've learned something, we'll say, what are you going to do with it now? And if you choose not to do anything, but then come back and say, oh, I learned that before, then yeah, 100% feel guilty.
that's this whole conversation is about a big long guilt trip. That's all it is.
but only if you don't act on your new learning. True. Right? Like that, you nailed it with your opening. It's got to be about action. So doing the work, rolling up your sleeves, becoming educated. Don't wait for other people to come to you. But if you have these feelings, then, start learning just like you would in other areas.
I think this next question will actually be a much faster answer for all of us. Are students allowed to perform scenes from Indigenous plays without appropriating? So we can think about that even from not just a drama perspective, but even if we're talking about in dance, taking on the role of characters from, I don't know, history, let's say, is that ever appropriate?
Depends.
I have an answer, but I want to talk about, let other people answer first.
I guess it would depend on what character they're being cast as. Right? If it's an Indigenous character or if it's a non-Indigenous character. But I don't know. For me, I don't feel it's appropriate for people that aren't from a culture to act as someone from the culture. If that makes sense. Yeah, if it's a play about Mohawk people, then I think it should be Mohawk people who are acting it out. Or, you know, my sister-in-law is a playwright, and I've been to many of her plays, and she always has Indigenous characters cast as, sorry, she always has Indigenous actors who are being played by Indigenous people, right? You know what I mean? So she's going to give me trouble if she ever sees this for not articulating that better.
Well, I will pass it on to Alanis like myself and say, oh, you should watch your brother-in-law in this
Oh,
conversation.
thanks for just calling me
Drama
out.
and dance.
Now everybody knows who it is. No, she's awesome. She really is. And what I really appreciate about the way she does everything is she brings the language into it all the time. And, you know, there's a lot of Indigenous people who are relearning, and the language is being rejuvenated. But there's a lot of us who would still struggle because we just don't know enough. So what if you're all of a sudden you want to do an Alanis King play, and there's all this Anishinaabe in it, and are you going to have students do that? Well, it's gonna, I don't think they would respect it in the same way.
I could play Jesus and when Jesus met Nanabush, though.
But see, that it all depends, right? Like,
I have that play.
Yeah, no, it's great. But you know what? I think you know what I'm saying, right? If you're
100%.
gonna have, if you have Anishinaabe characters, then you should have Anishinaabe actors or Indigenous actors. Like, maybe I should be a little bit more broad, right? But I think, but that is just if you're doing a play. Reading a play, I think that's a little different. But listen, this is your jam, so you go with it.
Oh, and this is a conversation that comes up a lot. And speaking with other colleagues, and I know for myself, like I have quite a few texts that I use in the drama classroom, but not to perform. So for instance, like I just to use a classic, I've already used Thompson Highway's The Res Sisters. I would never perform it. However, we would read it together, and then there's lots of different ways we could provoke some creation of other things and reactions to the play that could be of the student's own creation. Any play, but the thing is that it's good to bring those voices in, especially when we're talking about representation of different voices in the classroom. Because I mean, like the one thing, like, and this circles right back to the first question. If you're still just bringing dead white writers into the classroom, that's a problem. And let me even be broad on that: dead white male writers into the classroom. And when I talk about my own guilt and shame, I could look back when I was 24, first started teaching, and a lot of my English classes would have almost predominantly Canadian American or predominantly European, maybe American, some Canadian, and almost entirely male. If not male, white female. And I think that's we need to think about a very conscious choice about what we're presenting, what we're representing in the classroom. So I think it's important to bring in those texts, but how you use them is what's important. I agree, Troy, 100% that, and I work at a school that's predominantly, it's a rural school, predominantly Caucasian, and I would not cast those students in those roles. But there's lots of stuff we can do with reflective things, creative things, responding to the text. Arwyn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, totally. Learning a play doesn't mean you have to act it out, and you're great at that, Matt. I think your point about, well, the times are changing, right? And as the times change, we learn, right? There was a time when women weren't allowed to be on stage. My son's just going to hockey, and so men had to take, female roles. And as we become aware of the changing times, we have a responsibility to change with them. I was listening to this audiobook, how like the narrator, sometimes the author will read their own book. And anyway, it was obviously a white narrator. It was obviously a white person reading this book, but then like trying to take on these Black American vernacular accents when they were reading the Black parts. And it was like just so disgusting. Like you just like cringe, right? Like, no, you can't do it. But
That's really
when
bad.
teachers have this question, can I do this or can I not do this? And they want an answer, and they want somebody with authority to say, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not. And
We're all
I
saying
think,
no.
well, we're saying no, but I think that for something that's useful for teachers is to spend some time with the question rather than look to somebody else for an answer. Really sit with that question in your own body and go like, if I do this, how's it going to feel? How's it going to feel for me to put white kids in Indigenous roles? How's that going to look? How's that going to sound? Whereas, if I don't do it and I'm over here, I'm like, I'm a little more comfortable with, and then you got to trust that your heart a little bit, I think.
Yeah, it is interesting though to me that if we were to have this conversation about, because we're talking really effectively red face, there's a history of that in Hollywood and on stage. And but if we were to have the same conversation about blackface, we would not even hesitate. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm just saying it's interesting because I mean, like it's all about erasing the margins. If you have white people portraying marginalized people, it's highly problematic. It's because I mean, like they're not our voices. And I'm not saying that. And I'm a drama. I'm a theater guy. I love taking on roles. I love taking on challenging roles. But there's lots of meaty roles out there for people to take on without appropriating the voices of other people, right? But it's interesting because I mean, we still have these questions. I'm not saying we have these questions. I'm saying that as a society, sometimes people bring these questions up. It's like we can look back through history of just depictions of trans characters. For instance, there's a breadth of amazing trans performers, yet how many cisgendered male or female actors have taken on those roles and been applauded for it, but yet there was no attempt to make. I'm just saying that it's a broad question, so we have to look at when we look across the spectrum. I mean, if we're looking at people from a dominant culture, we shouldn't be appropriating those voices at all. And but should we be learning from those voices? 100%. We need to be bringing more of those voices in the classroom, and it'd be a longer conversation for me to articulate how I think they should be used in the classroom effectively without appropriation. And I'm willing to have that conversation with anyone who's watching this video down the road. Just saying, email me. But it's we need to learn from those voices, and there's stuff we can do with it, but not appropriate them at all. Full stop.
And you, but it's right there in the question, right? Perform versus study. That's at the end of the day, you want a clear-cut answer. Perform, no. Study, yes.
Yeah. And you said this was our jam. You just summed it up like so succinctly.
No, I said your. I said your.
That's what all right. So moving on to the next question. How do I connect social and historical injustice while creating hope and making space for joy? It's a good question.
Yeah, I really like that question because, one of the things that we come across is a lot of people are thinking everything's trauma, right? And there's a lot of trauma, but there's a lot of, as my good friend Jody says, there's a lot of beauty and brilliance in Indigenous culture that we need to bring forward as well. And, we were just talking about performing and talking about plays and whatnot. Well, I don't know how many plays that you've seen written by Indigenous playwrights, but you're laughing and crying at the same time. There's always that balance. There's always humor in so much of our work. Drew Hayden Taylor, who's known by so many because he's written so many awesome plays, it's full of humor, right? It's awesome. So for me, it's extremely important to bring the truth, but to bring that light, as I said in the very first question, and that light is often done with humor, but we have to celebrate the contributions and the resilience of Indigenous people, right? Because as more and more people learn and more of that truth is exposed, a lot of people say, oh my goodness, you guys are so resilient, right? And that's something for Indigenous students that they can latch onto and be proud of. it's like, yeah, we've got some work to do. We've got to learn, we've got to relearn our language. And in a lot of cases, we're learning more about our culture, but here's an opportunity to share how brilliant and how strong we are as Indigenous people, right? So yeah, I think there's there's a lot, right? There's a lot to unpack there, because there's so many different ways. Like we can come at it. We can come at it from, like, I know this is drama and dance, but you can come at it from an inquiry standpoint and allow the students to start uncovering or unpacking some of those injustices, and then allow them, how do you want to express yourself about this? Would you like to do a play? Would you like to do a rant? Would you like to do a performative dance that demonstrates all of these things, right?
I was about to say your bias is shown there about drama and dance. You're like, oh well, I know this is drama and dance, but inquiry. I'm like, we do inquiry in the drama and dance world, right, Troy?
No,
That's
you
the thing.
don't. Really?
Yeah, we do.
No, I'm kidding.
But no, you're 100% correct. All right, passing over to Arwyn. Arwyn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Troy, I'm with you. I love that aspect of what I'm familiar with as far as Indigenous culture, as always carrying this light-hearted humor with it. And so when I was in the classroom, like you say, balance, I think about the medicine wheel, and I think about the cyclical nature as well. Like, you might go through the hard winter, but you know that the spring is coming, and it's you're going to deal with the hard subjects, but also recognize that there is hope and that's part of it. Yeah, the seasons. That's what I like in a primary classroom, kindergarten classroom. These real simple ideas. Certainly, when I was teaching, we had lots of kids who had come from very difficult situations, like war and refugee situations. They'd experienced a lot of trauma, and yeah, so it's true. We can get into a rut of focusing on the hardships, but yeah, I think that was something that I would never teach the medicine wheel, but understanding the wisdom of it and understanding that there has to be a balance. You can't spend all your time in one spot. You've got to, give space to your emotions and your spirit. And yeah, I think that guided my thinking around it.
I'm like, so I had one thing pop in my head when we read this question. It was about how do we connect these things, and then still space for joy. And I was going to say intentionality, bring the joy, people. Because like we can get so mired, and I've been guilty of this too in many different contexts, mired in looking at things from a social or historical injustice. Also, bring it to the now, because a lot of times people get bogged down. And if we're talking about from a drama perspective, don't just bring in texts that are historical texts. Bring in texts that are looking at the contemporary and Indigenous experience from multiple different lenses, because as we all know, it's not a panacea. It's different from coast to coast and within communities. And as Troy pointed out at the beginning, like we all have our own voices to bring even from our own place that we're coming from. And so I think it's important to bring it to the now and to intentionally make room for joy, because we don't sometimes, especially as educators, we can get mired in the things that don't recognize the joy. And also bringing those voices in, like making sure you're utilizing those voices as a contrast or as a foil to, or instead of like other voices, is right there celebrating those voices, and make sure you're using look at where you are. Think about, are you bringing in any voices from the local communities around you? Are you bringing in different perspectives from an Indigenous perspective across Turtle Island? I mean, like, and then so really we're celebrating those voices. So I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it, but I think that's how we can find that balance, and it's got to be intentional, for sure.
Yeah, and I think again, there has to be action connected to it. So if we're talking about these social and historical injustices, I think it's all right for us to ask, so how does this make you feel? How do you want to express your learning around this? And what action steps might you take, right, to do these things? But I agree, Matt, keeping things looking at it from a contemporary lens backwards makes it a little bit easier for the students to connect to, right? So that it doesn't seem like it's such a history thing, but it allows them to make those connections and intentionality. But I love the part that I love about the question is making space. That's been a lot of thinking I've been doing lately around how are we making spaces for Indigenous voices to be heard, right? So how can we do that? And bringing these new contemporary realities and work that Indigenous people are doing is, I think, is a really good way to bridge the gap between the historical and the now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Speaking of using voices in the classroom, the next question asks very simply, what is the difference between appropriation and appreciation?
I'm gonna let you guys answer this one first.
Well, I'm gonna let Arwyn answer it first.
So my understanding, and I could be way off with this, but when there is one culture that persecutes or oppresses another culture, you can't then go and take the artifacts and like say, yay, look at what we got. Like, if we go ahead and acknowledge the truth of colonization on Turtle Island, and we go ahead and acknowledge the genocide and acknowledge the Indian Act and recognize the theft essentially of Indigenous art that has happened here, then we obviously know, like, you can't do that. However, people say to me, like when I was teaching it, people would be like, so my kids can't sing an Indigenous song, but can they sing a Ukrainian song? Or they didn't understand what varying from culture to culture. And to me, it had to do with that oppression, so I don't know if that's how other people think about that, but.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I think it's perspective and relationship. So I mean, like, and shared history. So I mean, like, if you think of the shared history, within the borders, artificial borders that we consider Canada, it's there's relationships that exist and shared experiences from a very different perspective that disallow us from appropriating those voices, or should anyways, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying people don't do that, because it happens, but I also think it's as simple as like what we were just talking about, bringing the published works of Indigenous playwrights into the room, but not performing it, but using it to create something completely different, or using it to spark responses. I'm thinking in like the dance classroom, and the use of body and possibly emotions that you're feeling, learning and listening to things, is appreciating that work. Whereas like if we're just taking it, all right, now Sally, you're playing this person, Jimmy, you're playing this person, and we put it on, is we're appropriating it. If I've participated, as you said, with the medicine wheel, like I've participated in multiple, I've been invited in different cultural experiences that were for myself. Like I've gone to a sweat that was for myself. I was taught how to round dance. I've been taught how to hoop dance a few different times. And I thought I was really good at it until like I saw someone else, whose culture it was, who also did it for years. I'm like, I got that one hoop going, I'm like, woo, yeah, look at me go. And then like it was Troy, there was a Nimke, who we had a fire a bunch of times, but it was also a code conference, and amazing, like simply amazing. And but like there's a huge difference between being invited in to experience something, and then what do I do with that after the fact? Like, I'm not going to go out and hoop dance, or I'm not going to teach it. It's not my culture. I don't fully understand the implications and the connections to it culturally. But as a settler trying to do this learning and grow, I will experience those things for myself. And it helps me grow as an individual. It helps me in the work that I'm doing. Is best of the way I can think about it, appropriation versus appreciation. And you're nodding, Troy. So I think it's you. Like, yeah, I passed the buck, and now.
Yeah, where you can move on to the next one. But no, you're right, Matt. If if I went into a Catholic church and they were doing a baptism, right? And I'm pretty observant. Like I could probably, learn quite a bit, but I would never, ever, ever show up the next week and say, "Oh, I got this. I got this. I'll do it." No, I'm
Hold
good.
on there, Padre. We're good. I got this.
Yeah, I got it. Right. So
I don't know. I think you should though. Now that you
Yeah.
said that, you've thrown that in the world, and I'll be there. I'll watch.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. When it comes to drama and dance, and I had to remind myself this is drama and dance, because when I hear this most often, it's around art, as in I know drama and dance is art. Don't even go there.
You mean visual arts.
I
You mean visual arts.
I
I got you.
But visual arts. But I think of recently this past summer, I'm in my wife's community and we were attending the powwow. And during powwow, you have that now in Wiki, they have a competition powwow, right? So they have different categories and in different age groups, and they all compete, for some prizes kind of thing. But interspersed between all of those competition dances, they have what are called intertribal dances, which essentially means everybody is welcome to join and go around the circle, right? To dance in that circle as a way of, participating in the beauty and brilliance of Indigenous cultures taking part in a powwow, right? And not every group has a powwow, just putting that out there. But, people are welcome to do that. That is an appropriate time to do it because there's an appreciation that is happening in the moment of. But I would never condone a teacher saying, okay, we're going to learn about a powwow. We're going to watch some YouTube videos and play some big drum songs. And now all of you children, you've watched different dance styles. Now I want you to mimic what they did as I'm playing this powwow song. That would be completely inappropriate and you might get yourself in trouble. So that's a pretty drastic example, but it's happened.
No, oh, I know. And I agree. I think that the best thing that you said there when referring to being at the powwow, physically going to the powwow and being invited in is completely different than walking away from that experience and going, okay, I've experienced this one time and now I can get some YouTube videos and we're going to do this. It's not the same thing.
No, and I don't want to put people off from watching the YouTube videos because I think it's awesome and absolutely look at the different styles that are involved at a powwow. I would suggest look at a whole bunch of different styles from all kinds of different nations. I'm just thinking of some of our social songs, and as Haudenosaunee people, we have socials. It's our own little dance, if you will, right? But we have different songs, we have different dances that we do for the particular songs. Well, the Inuit do something different. The Métis do something different. The Haida do something different. So really looking at the breadth of indigeneity across the country, I think is also really important in all of this conversation. So we're not just looking at one particular group or style. I think that's super, super important.
100%. Now, this is a really important question. And I think this kind of leads into that when we're talking about different approaches, etc. How do I relay this to other teachers? When it said the question said when planning, but I think just in general, like because these are hard conversations to have with people. But how do I relay this to other teachers? Like everything we've been talking about.
I remember at the conference one of the teachers said, oh, well, we don't have any Indigenous students at our school. And I thought, you don't know that for sure. Like, have you really asked every single family? Have you really, like, sometimes people hide their indigeneity or whatever, for whatever reason. But I found in the public school where I was teaching, where we wouldn't have necessarily identified kids as Indigenous, once we started, making like representation, using Indigenous languages on the walls, speaking when we could, and then these kids sort of started to emerge and say, oh yeah, I know that. And so if you've got Indigenous families, I know I'm a little off tangent here, but if your people are in your school, like, those are friends that are really important to make, and people that you would really like to have as consultants. And it's not that these people can give you the authority to go ahead and do the power, absolutely not. But if they're in the classroom, at least you've got, I think that's a way of building friendships and relationships within your school and making the school feel like a more safe place for Indigenous kids. I could be totally wrong. Like, maybe there are schools where there's no Indigenous kids whatsoever. But anyway, I was amazed when I had no idea at this public school how many Indigenous families there were. And once we got them, like, once we connected with them, there was a whole room full. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and you don't know. But you don't know. That's the thing. You wouldn't, for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to unpack in here. But I think exactly what you're talking about right there, Arwyn, that kind of draws us right back to the question of how do we, with other teachers too, it's about that community building, is about that, and about having the conversation and build. And when you build those communities with your families, but we're talking about the intersectionality here, like everyone, right? Like, if we're talking about culturally responsive, reflective pedagogy, we need to be talking to those families, we need to be talking to those students, and really, like, personalizing the experience to an extent that, getting back to when we were joking about inquiry, like, what do they bring in, how are we interacting with them? And it's the same thing as our work families. And sometimes there are hard conversations that have to happen. And when talking about how can we have those conversations, there's a difference between guilt and shame and being uncomfortable. As I said before, being uncomfortable with learning something, that happens all the time. You learn something for the first time, you didn't know it, you go, whoa, like, I feel a lot of discomfort because of this. But if I think it goes right back to what Arwyn said, Troy echoed it. If you know something, if you're learning something and you're not actively changing what's happening, that's when you feel like, where you should feel like guilt and shame for not acting. And so we have to have these conversations in schools. We need to be having them in a variety of different ways, but when we're talking about just about decolonization and reconciliation, if there's no, I hate to say top down, because I like to think of leadership as a circle. I look at myself as being just as much in charge as the director of education. Like, that's what I like to think, because it's a circle. So like, we need to be having these conversations from one side of the circle to the other, and informing ourselves about pedagogical practices, best practices, and challenging yourselves to look at what doesn't work anymore. Because as time goes on, I like what Arwyn said earlier, as time goes on, things change. Like code, we put out policies, documents. Like, I'm extremely proud of the In a Good Way document that we put out in 2018. But that was 4 years ago. We're already talking about the fact that we need to look at that document very carefully and think, how does it need to be updated for 2022? It's only been 4 years. So we need to actively be having those conversations, and it has to not just be in dark corners of the school, like, hey, you taught this play yet? So I think it's as blunt as that the conversations have to happen.
And they need to be done in a good way, right? Not pulling on the pun, but I'm being honest in there, because we can't be preachy. So if you're passionate, I think that's awesome. Sometimes we need to temper our passion and understand that not everyone else is as passionate as we are. about these things, and we need to take small steps and just, have those conversations, be intentional in having conversations, because we do need to work, or sorry, we do need to continue to move this work forward. And the only way we're going to do that is to have more people involved. So I often tell people, I'm creating change one conversation at a time. And in this work, what I have found from my perspective is it takes a lot of time. And we say it's not cups of tea, it's pots of tea. So it's important to recognize that. And trust me, no one wants to move faster than I do to make change, to bring about understanding and awareness and move things forward and try to reverse the last 300-400 years of oppression and colonization. But it does take one conversation at a time. But if it's done in a good way that respects where people are at, and I guess that's the other thing, you have to meet people where they're at, and then gauge where they're at and start the conversation there. But it does take one conversation at a time.
Yeah, I was thinking, I 100% agree. Because I think like if you look at the journey of reconciliation, because we're all on that same journey, right? Or at different points. So I mean, like if someone's like way over here and then someone else is way over here, then you can't have the same conversation. Like you're coming from different perspectives. And no, you never make friends with being preachy. That's just hands down. No one likes to ever say, "Oh, here he goes again," and then they shut you down. Ears closed. It's got an open heart. Arwyn?
I think when we think about decolonization, we can recognize that colonization has in fact hurt all of us. Like it didn't just hurt the Indigenous people, right? It hurt everyone. It continues to hurt everyone. And I think, look, you can look at the damage of toxic masculinity, even for white dudes who are in positions of power. Like, this system is not serving you. And it might be hard to convince some of them, but it doesn't serve women. We recognize that. It doesn't serve. So when we're all recognizing that we need to change everything, I'm trying to say, I'm thinking beyond what I've got words for yet at this point, but I think, reconciliation isn't just fixing this one problem, but, settler and Indigenous relations. It's really like making fundamental systemic change for a better, like for the next 7 generations, right? For the kids to have potentially better futures. And so when you're trying to convince other teachers that they should be doing this work, there is something in it for them, right? It's not just to improve the lives of Indigenous people. It's going to improve the lives of everyone. I got to think about that. I should think before I speak. I don't know.
No, I love watching your thought process. I think it's delightful. I think I agree 100% with what you're saying. And I think that if I were to just like be personal for 1 second, because I'm so not personal all the time. My own, like the journey I started like probably about 13 years ago, really delving deeper into how my career has gone now through learning. I've done courses around Indigenous education, conferences, workshops with this wonderful curriculum leader I have named Troy Maracle, has really shifted my pedagogy and my practice. Like it's changed, it's fundamentally changed me as a person. It's not just about the materials that I bring into the classroom, or just it's transformative. And I think it's a way of looking at things that all the buzzwords we're using now in education connect back to. And we think we're being so much ingenuity and so much creativity, like yes, oh yes, culturally responsive pedagogy, trauma-informed practice, personalization learning, differentiated instruction. I mean, I know all those have been around for a long time, but my point though is that if you look at it in that continuum, again, the circle, you know, it's not the director at the top, it's everyone in charge of everything, they all feed into each other and lead to that educating the whole person, which is, I mean, I think what we all want compassionate, empathetic, well-developed, critical, creative thinkers who want to build relationships. And so getting back to reconciliation is all about relationship building. And I think as drama and dance educators specifically, we have access to that. We build relationships all the time. Like that's what we do. I never had a drama class where, well, yeah, I probably have, but where like, you know, you don't have like relationships that were never there. Like they only had them because of what we were doing. And when you extend that beyond there, that's the way we should be in life, right? We should be able to build those relationships. And that's how, like, with whomever we're with, regardless of background, regardless of differences that we might have, but we can build that relationship. And that's the path forward together, alongside, not like a patriarchal type thing. Anyway, we're gonna get too political. We've already had enough statements come out today. They're gonna have people going, wait a minute, what kind of conversation is happening here? I'm just kidding. All right, we had two more questions, but they kind of feed into each other. So I'm going to ask them as one question, and we'll answer it however we feel like it. But it was, how can I do this appropriately when I'm just learning this content myself? And the other one was, how do I know what's appropriate if I don't have permission? Because they're kind of about, like, you know, not knowing, both of them about not knowing or not fully being aware. Who wants to tackle that first?
You know, back to my, like, our school system, our colonized school system is built on a sort of an oppressive model with the teacher fronted, you know, knowledge bearer with everyone else assumed ignorant. And when we teach in a circle, or when we let everyone have access to the fire kind of thing, when everyone is sharing knowledge, then you don't have to have all the answers, right? You can be learning alongside your students, which is a more humble kind of approach. You're not standing there trying to say, I know everything.
How did you get in my head, Arwyn? You're right in there taking my thoughts. A thought thief.
Yeah,
I agree.
That was the first thing that I was going to say is, you know, as educators, we need to get over ourselves sometimes and think that we know or need to know everything. That's maybe the latter part is more important. We don't need to know everything. We just don't. And I often say I've been doing this for a long time and I still have so much to learn. And that is how I position myself all the time, as a learner, and be a learner alongside of your students. Bring in authentic voices who do know, right? Every school board in Ontario has an Indigenous education lead who is doing the work, who is building relationships, who can maybe help introduce you to someone that you can build a relationship with that can help you in this work, right? It's not up to the Indigenous lead to solely have all of the relationships. It's up to everyone, right, to build those. So those are my two big things, is that building the relationships, going back to your point, Matt, around building relationships, bringing in authentic voices, and of course, in person, live is always awesome. But one thing that we learned through the pandemic is that we can do what we're doing right now in having guest speakers in this way. But that's not the only way to bring in authentic voices. It's through the resources themselves, letting the plays, letting the music, letting the novel, letting those words and the words written by or sung by Indigenous people, let those be the experts those authentic voices. We don't have to analyze and break down and say, well, they're actually saying this. No, let the students decide for themselves what is being said, right? I think that that's really appropriate. And as far as the permission piece, I guess I would need to ask permission for what? What is being asked of in that case?
Mhm.
And maybe the question is, if you are wondering if you need permission, don't do it. That's the
Exactly,
simple
yeah.
one, right? If
Mhm.
you're not sure if you have permission or if you need permission, then don't do it.
I want to jump on that permission question for a second, because I've had very many different conversations, and this is a little bit of a tangent. This is a little bit of a warning area too, is that not, Troy, you did a really good job of answering it earlier when you talked about not being the voice of all Indigenous people, because you're not. You're Troy, you're 35 minutes away from my place right now, down the road. You get bugged by me when I text you because you said reach out to your Indigenous education lead. I'm like, it's always nice to have their cell phone number. But it's also when you talk to someone, and because I've had this conversation with people, no one can give permission for everyone. And that's important to take away from this conversation, because I've had conversations where people say, well, I talked to someone from this community who said I could do this, so I do this. And I'm not, it was a honest intent. Remember, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Their intention was, oh, I want to explore these voices, but they're appropriating. They talked to someone who said, yeah, sure. And they took that as a ubiquitous, these are this is a permission to use these voices, and it's not. And I think that we need to, it still goes back to building relationships. Troy, I like exactly what you said. Reach out to your Indigenous education lead, talk to people, and meet people and have those connections where you can have conversations. And I firmly agree as well. If you think, oh, would I need permission to do this? Then don't. If it's, yeah, it's probably the safer bet. But I think another thing that we haven't really hit on tonight that I think is important to take away is that don't be afraid to make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes. Because I mean, like, we all make mistakes in this work and in all work. So I mean, like, the thing though is that, like, what we never want to do is double down on those mistakes, because when you double down on wrong, it's still wrong. It's not two wrongs make a right. So that's one thing you always have to take.
I mean, I have to say, there's no way I would have been able to do the kind of teaching that I did unless I'd made some fundamentally gigantic mistakes.
Mhm.
Those mistakes were the work.
Yeah, but you learn from those mistakes.
Mhm.
Yeah, but some people don't. I mean, like, we see it when we recycle the same thing. If it doesn't work, or if it's something that we really shouldn't be doing. And so I think that's really important to take away. All right. Well, wow. This I could have talked to both of you all night, but we all have other things to do with our time too. Any last words that anyone wants to share with our audience before we sign off? Troy, anything last words you want to say?
I guess my biggest piece is don't be afraid to try. I hear that a lot. I hear a lot of people say, I'm so scared. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to do something wrong. So they don't do it. What I say to that is, by making a choice, or by doing nothing, is still making a choice. And it's just perpetuating the issue, right? So if you reach out, if you take some of these nuggets of advice that we've tried to give you tonight and you apply them, you're going to be in a good place. And as Arwyn said, you're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, but you learn from them. But at least you're trying, right? And reach out to the people that can help support you. And trust me, there are people. The leads can do it. They absolutely can. And they'll be able to have even deeper conversations and flesh out some of this conversation even that much more. or at least put you in touch with people who can. So
For sure.
I guess that's what I would share.
Any other parting words?
The best advice I ever got was slow down. Because
Yeah.
in our school systems, there's all these confines and urgency to get things done. And you're just like, that's where some of the fear comes from. And I had a hard time learning to go slower, but it's really important advice.
100%. I love that.
Mhm.
Okay, everyone out there who watches this, slow down. I try that. I've heard that myself, and I still need to learn that. On behalf of Code, I want to thank both of you so much for this conversation. And I want to thank everyone who was at that workshop back in Hamilton and all the way back in October 2022. And this conversation is much larger than these 6 questions, and is something that needs to be happening everywhere. So thank you so much, everyone.
Mhm.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you.